It was one of those quiet evenings that seemed to stretch endlessly, where the world outside felt just a little too still. The kind of evening that invites you to settle in, draw the curtains, and wrap yourself in the comfort of your own space. The clock on the wall ticked softly, its rhythm almost lulling me into a sense of peace. I was sitting in my living room, a cup of tea in hand, staring out the window at the street below. The world outside looked familiar, almost comforting. The houses lined up neatly on either side of the street, each with its own warm light glowing from the windows. People came and went, some in cars, some on foot. The neighborhood was quiet but lively in its own way. It was the kind of place where you could walk down the street and exchange a few words with neighbors, where everyone knew everyone else, or at least thought they did. I had always felt safe here. In fact, I'd been living in this same house for years. It was nothing extravagant, just a small, modest place, but it had become my sanctuary. The creaky floors, the old wooden beams in the ceiling, the smell of freshly brewed coffee that seemed to linger even when the pot was empty, it all felt like home. A place where nothing could disturb the peace, or so I thought. It wasn't until I heard it that I realized how wrong I was. The sound was faint at first, barely noticeable above the usual hum of the evening. A slight creak, like someone walking across the floor above me. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, listening closely. The house was old, and I had gotten used to its sounds. The house settling, the wind moving through the cracks in the windows. But this was different. This sound was deliberate. It wasn't the house. It was someone. I stood up, setting my cup of tea down with a soft clink. I glanced toward the hallway that led to the staircase, my pulse quickening. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe the neighbors were moving about, their voices carrying through the walls. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I walked toward the staircase, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The creak of the floorboards echoed through the empty house, as if the walls themselves were listening. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, my hand resting on the banister, my eyes scanning the darkened hallway. There was nothing unusual, no broken windows, no open doors, but the air felt heavier somehow, like something was waiting, something just out of sight. I told myself I was being paranoid. There was no reason to be scared. This was my home, after all. But the unease lingered, creeping up my spine like a cold breath. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "It's nothing," I whispered, almost as if saying it aloud would make the feeling go away. But just as I turned to head back to the living room, I heard it again. This time it was louder, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from above. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. Part 2. A Step into the Unknown. I stood there, rooted to the spot, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The footsteps were unmistakable, but they didn't sound like someone moving around casually. They were slow, methodical, as if whoever was up there was deliberately trying to be heard. The house, once so familiar, suddenly felt foreign, its creaks and groans now carrying a weight that made my stomach twist with unease. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move. My feet felt heavy, like they were reluctant to carry me toward whatever waited upstairs. I gripped the banister tighter, my fingers white with the effort. My heart raced as I ascended the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. The footsteps above me stopped as I reached the top of the staircase, and I froze again, straining to listen. For a moment, there was nothing. The house was eerily silent, and I almost thought I'd imagined it. But then I heard a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It came from the farthest room at the end of the hallway. I couldn't place it. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to send a jolt of panic through me. I turned to the left, where the guest room lay, the door slightly ajar. A thin line of light bled out into the hallway, the faintest glow from a lamp I hadn't left on. I knew I had turned it off before I came downstairs. I hadn't even been up here for hours. Something wasn't right. I tiptoed toward the room, trying to keep my breathing steady, but it was impossible. Each breath seemed louder than the last. My pulse thrummed in my ears, drowning out all other sounds. The air felt thick with tension, and my feet seemed to drag with each step, as if the house itself was trying to hold me back. When I reached the door, I paused. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it. What was I hoping to find? Or perhaps more importantly, what was I afraid of finding? The scraping sound continued, closer now. It was almost like nails dragging across wood, each scratch sending a chill down my spine. My fingers trembled as I twisted the knob and pushed the door open just a crack. The room was dark, save for the dim light spilling from the lamp on the bedside table. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the gloom. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The bed was made, the curtains were drawn, and the floor was bare. But then my gaze shifted to the far corner of the room. A shadow moved. I froze again, my breath caught in my throat. For a split second, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But no, there was something there, something I couldn't quite make out. It was as though the shadow was alive, shifting and undulating in a way that didn't make sense. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of the room, but my legs refused to move. I was paralyzed, caught between the need to flee and the compulsion to understand what was happening. And then, as if sensing my hesitation, the shadow began to grow. It stretched out across the floor, inching toward me with an almost deliberate slowness. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow and rapid. Every part of me screamed to turn and leave, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The shadow didn't stop. It reached the foot of the bed, and then it began to shift upward, rising like a dark cloud. I stumbled back, my hands fumbling for the door. My pulse raced, and I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears as I pulled the door shut behind me. The moment I stepped back into the hallway, the room seemed to go quiet. The shadow was gone, but the sense of dread that lingered was enough to make my skin crawl. I leaned against the wall, gasping for air, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it just the light playing tricks on me? Or was there something else in this house? Something I couldn't see. I didn't have answers, only questions that gnawed at me, digging deeper into my thoughts with each passing second. I needed to figure this out. I couldn't just ignore it. But as I stood there, trying to gather my thoughts, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not from behind, but from somewhere else. Somewhere closer. The house, my home, suddenly felt like a place I didn't belong. The hallway stretched before me, too quiet, too still. I pressed my back against the wall, my mind still reeling from the shadow in the guest room. What had I seen? What was it? I couldn't make sense of it. There had to be an explanation, but none of them seemed to make any sense. Can I ask for... I glanced down at my hands, which were still trembling. My breath was shallow, my pulse quick. I had to calm myself. This was just a trick of the mind, I told myself. I had to pull myself together. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house, which had always felt like a safe haven, now felt oppressive, like it was closing in around me. The shadows in the corners of the hallway seemed to stretch longer than they should, and the air felt heavier. I looked back at the guest room door, still slightly ajar, the dim light still spilling out. Should I go back in? Was there something I missed? Or was I just imagining things? I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. There was no point in going back in there. Whatever it wasn't real. I needed to leave the house, to clear my head. Maybe a walk would help. Fresh air. That's what I needed. I turned toward the stairs, determined to get out of the house. But as I did, I froze. From the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A figure, tall and shadowy, just standing there at the bottom of the stairs. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't imagined that. I couldn't have. The shape, though brief, had been unmistakable. I turned quickly, my feet almost slipping on the stairs as I hurried down to the front door. My thoughts were a blur, my mind racing through every possible explanation. I grabbed the door handle, ready to escape the suffocating feeling in the house, but then I stopped. The door wouldn't budge. It was locked. I distinctly remembered locking it before going upstairs, but now the lock was stiff and unyielding. Panic surged through me. Why wasn't it opening? I twisted the handle again, harder this time, but it remained stubbornly in place. A cold chill washed over me. Something was wrong. My fingers trembled as I fumbled with the lock, my breath quickening. The silence around me was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. I could hear the soft sound of my heartbeat in my ears, louder now, as if the house itself was echoing my fear. Then, from behind me, I heard a noise. It was a faint rustling, like fabric moving in the breeze. My body tensed, every muscle going rigid. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see whatever it was. But I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I turned. The living room was empty. The windows were dark, and the only sound was the creaking of the house settling. Nothing was out of place, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. It was as though the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting for something. Waiting for me. I took a deep breath and turned back to the door. But as I did, something caught my eye. A shadow, darker than the rest, flickered across the floor in the corner of the room. I froze again, my eyes locked on the spot. The shadow didn't move, didn't shift. It just lingered there, as though it was waiting for me to notice it. My mind raced. Was I going crazy? Had I just seen something that wasn't there? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my thoughts, but when I looked back at the shadow, it was gone. Just like that. I reached for the door handle once more, determined to get out. This time, the door opened. The click of the lock releasing was a small victory, but it didn't feel like enough. I stepped out into the cool night air, but the feeling of unease didn't leave me. It lingered, hanging over me like a storm cloud, waiting to burst. I took a deep breath and walked down the front steps, trying to steady myself. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets empty. I tried to focus on the sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the wind, anything to calm my nerves. But the unease never fully left me. It clung to me like a shadow, always just out of sight, but always there. As I walked, my thoughts kept drifting back to the house, to the shadow, to the feeling of being watched. I had to go back. I had to find out what was happening, what was lurking in the corners of my home. But the fear that gripped me made it hard to move forward. I was afraid of what I might find. What if it was more than just a shadow? What if it was something else entirely? The shadow sifted through the house, looking for evidence of my recent attack. What I must have left behind. The night air outside was cool against my skin, but it did little to soothe the anxiety that churned in my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. something just beyond my understanding, and the more I walked away from the house, the more the urge to return gnawed at me. It was like an invisible tether, pulling me back. I kept walking down the quiet street, my footsteps echoing against the pavement. The stillness of the neighborhood was unsettling, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I glanced over my shoulder several times, expecting to see someone or something following me. But there was nothing, just the darkness and the soft rustle of trees in the wind. Less than 60 yards down the center of the street, a man stood there, his arms crossed over his chest. A bank of smoke cast conspicuously by the lights of the parking lot. Far off in the distance was a street light and a cottonwood tree. The street lights cast long, distorted shadows, their dim glow barely reaching the corners of the road. It all felt wrong, too still, too empty. And then, from the depths of that silence, came a sound. A low, muffled noise, almost like a whisper. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, listening intently. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It sounded like a voice, but not one I recognized. It was as though someone was speaking from far away, from within the house. A voice that wasn't mine, and yet it seemed to call to me, drawing me back. I shook my head, trying to clear the haze of fear clouding my thoughts. No, I wasn't going back. I had to keep moving, to get away from the house, away from whatever was haunting me. But the voice wouldn't stop. It echoed in my ears, soft and insistent, pulling me back like an invisible hand. My feet moved against my will, carrying me back toward the house. I told myself I was being foolish, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the more I walked, the stronger the compulsion became. The voice wasn't just a whisper now. It was growing louder, clearer, as if it was right behind me, calling my name. By the time I reached the house, I felt like I was in a trance, my thoughts disjointed, my body moving on its own. The front door was still ajar, just as I had left it. The darkness inside felt deeper now, like it was swallowing the light from the outside. I hesitated for a moment, my hand resting on the doorframe before stepping inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the house seemed to shift. The air was thick, charged with a presence that I couldn't see, but I could feel it. It was as though the walls themselves were watching me, waiting for me to make a move. My heart pounded in my chest, and every step I took felt heavier, like I was walking through thick fog. I turned back toward the hallway, the one that had once felt so familiar, so safe. Now it felt like a maze, its dark corners stretching farther than I remembered. I could still hear the faint whispers coming from somewhere within the house, but they weren't just voices anymore. They were something else. A low vibration that seemed to crawl under my skin, making my blood run cold. I walked cautiously, my footsteps muffled on the old wood floors. Every creak of the house seemed amplified in the silence, each sound making my pulse race faster. As I neared the guest room, I stopped. The door was open, just like before, but this time there was no light spilling out. It was darker than it had been earlier, as though the room had swallowed the light whole. A sudden gust of wind blew through the open window, making the curtains flutter wildly. I jumped back, startled, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I couldn't shake the thought that something was in that room, something waiting for me, something that wasn't human. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. My breath caught in my throat as I crossed the threshold. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the house. and the air felt thick with an unnatural heaviness. The window was open wide, the curtains dancing in the wind, but it wasn't the wind that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced around the room, my eyes searching every corner. There was nothing out of place. The bed was made, the furniture arranged as it had been earlier. But then I saw it. Something small, almost insignificant, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. On the floor, just beneath the bed, was a single, old-fashioned doll. Its glass eyes stared up at me, cold and lifeless. I hadn't noticed it before. Had it always been there? I couldn't remember. But now it felt wrong, like it was waiting for me to see it. I knelt down to pick it up, my hands shaking. The doll was heavier than it should have been, its porcelain face cracked in places. But what disturbed me most was the smell. A musty, decayed scent clung to it, as though it had been buried for years. I dropped it, startled, and it hit the floor with a dull thud. The moment it touched the ground, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the air in the room seemed to grow colder. The shadows around me seemed to stretch, reaching for me. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and I backed away from the doll, my eyes wide with fear. Then the door slammed shut behind me. The door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls, and I jumped, my heart racing in my chest. I spun around, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps, but the room was empty. No one was there, no one visible, at least, but I could feel it. That presence. It was like a weight in the air, a suffocating pressure that pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The darkness seemed to thicken around me, swirling like a living thing closing in from all sides. The shadows, which had once been benign, now felt like they were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The whispers had stopped, but the hum, that low, vibrating sound, was still there. It was as if the walls themselves were vibrating with it. "Huh?" she asked. "Are you waiting for me?" I took a step back, my foot brushing against the doll. It lay there on the floor, its cold eyes staring up at me, and I shuddered. I had to get out of here. I couldn't stay in this room. I couldn't stay in this house. But the door wouldn't open. I spun around again, my mind racing for an explanation, anything to make sense of this. The air was still thick, and the silence was almost unbearable. It was as though time itself had slowed, stretching out the moments, amplifying every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. Suddenly I heard it again. A whisper, but this time it was closer, right behind me. My skin prickled with the sensation of someone breathing down my neck. I froze, every muscle in my body locking in place, and I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. The room was still empty, but something had changed. I could feel it now, the presence. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was something tangible, something that moved with me, just out of sight. I could sense its movement, its deliberate, calculated pace, as though it was circling me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I backed up, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything. The doll was still there, lying on the floor, and it felt like the key to everything. I couldn't explain why, but it did. The doll wasn't just an object. It was part of whatever this was. I needed to get rid of it, to destroy it, to make whatever was here go away. I bent down quickly, my hands trembling as I reached for the doll. The moment my fingers brushed its cold surface, a sharp, piercing pain shot through my head. I staggered back, gasping, as if the pain had been injected straight into my skull. The world around me blurred, and I stumbled, trying to steady myself. I could hear the whispering again, louder now, echoing in my mind. Cold and overwhelming. It was not just a whisper, it was a voice. A voice I didn't recognize, but it felt familiar. It felt like it had always been there, just beneath the surface of my thoughts, waiting for me to listen. You shouldn't have come back. The words were clear now, cutting through the fog in my mind. I turned, my body trembling with fear, and there it was. The shadow. It wasn't a shape, not exactly. It was like a dark mist, an absence of light, moving across the room, growing larger, stretching toward me. The coldness in the air intensified, and I could feel the chill sinking into my bones. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. There was no way out. The house felt alive, its walls closing in on me, its floorboards creaking with every step I took. The shadows seemed to follow my every move, an oppressive presence that blocked out the light. The door had to open. I ran for it, my hand reaching for the handle again, but it was still stuck. I yanked, desperate, pulling with all my strength, but the door wouldn't move. The shadow was almost upon me now, its form twisting and shifting, a dark mass that seemed to swallow the light. I could feel its cold, its presence pressing against me, suffocating me. You shouldn't have come back, the voice whispered again, this time louder, closer. Now you're mine. I screamed, the sound of my voice echoing in the empty house. My hand, slick with sweat, slipped off the door handle, and I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. The room seemed to spin, the walls bending in toward me, the darkness closing in like a trap. I had to get out, I had to leave, but I couldn't. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the door creaked open. The door opened with a groan, and for a moment I stood there, frozen, unsure whether it was real. My heart was racing, my body shaking with fear, but the way the door slowly inched open felt like a lifeline, a chance to escape this nightmare that had enveloped me. The shadow was still there, lingering at the edge of my vision, but the door was open, and that was all that mattered. I didn't hesitate. I rushed through the door, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and I slammed it shut behind me with a force that rattled the frame. The lock clicked into place, but I didn't stop to check if it was secure. I couldn't. I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. The hallway was dark, but at least it was empty. No whispers. No shadow. For the first time since I entered this house, I felt a glimmer of relief. But it was fleeting, vanishing as quickly as it had come. My pulse was still hammering in my chest, my mind reeling from what I had just experienced. The clock ticked on with a great slowness, and the mason body grew dim with the centrum, slowly. I had to get out. I had to leave this place. The house was suffocating, its walls closing in on me with every passing second. I needed to get outside, to breathe, to feel the air that wasn't tainted by whatever was haunting me here. I turned down the hallway, my footsteps quickening as I approached the front door, but as I reached for the handle, I froze. Something was wrong. The door was locked. I knew I had unlocked it earlier, but now it was sealed shut, just like the room I had just fled. My breath hitched, and I pulled on the handle again, harder this time. It didn't budge. Panic surged through me, and I spun around, searching for another way out. There had to be another door, a window, anything. But the hallway was empty, silent, too silent. I ran to the nearest window and pulled the curtain back. The glass was dark, but I could make out the faintest outline of the alley outside. It was quiet out there. Too quiet. The alley was bathed in an eerie stillness, the kind of silence that felt wrong, unnatural. I grabbed the window latch, yanking it open with all my strength, but the window wouldn't budge. It was as if it was welded shut. Desperation clawed at me, and I slammed my fists against the glass, but it didn't crack. It didn't even shake. I backed away from the window, my mind spinning, my thoughts racing. I was trapped. There was no escape. The house was holding me here, and whatever presence I had felt earlier, it was still here, watching, waiting. I could feel it again. That coldness. The suffocating weight of something unseen. It was as if the very air had thickened, pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. The walls seemed to be closing in, the house itself shifting, growing darker, and then I heard it. A faint scraping sound, a soft, deliberate noise coming from somewhere in the house. I froze, my blood running cold. The sound was so subtle, but it sent a chill through my spine. It was like something dragging along the floor, slow and steady, methodical. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right behind me. I turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. Nothing, no shadow, no presence. Just the same quiet emptiness that had consumed the house. Alas, but I could still hear it. The scraping, closer now, almost at my feet. Gaia sighed and curled up in the crooks of my arm, and I looked down. The doll, it was there again, sitting in the middle of the hallway, its cold, lifeless eyes staring up at me. How had it gotten there? I hadn't seen it when I had rushed out of the room. My heart skipped a beat as I bent down, my hand trembling as I reached for it. I couldn't leave it there. I couldn't leave it to follow me. The moment my fingers brushed its surface, a cold shiver ran down my spine, and the scraping stopped. The house was silent again, but the air felt heavier, more oppressive. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. There at the end of the hallway was a figure. It was a silhouette, standing perfectly still, bathed in the faint light coming from the front door. But it wasn't human. The shape was too wrong, too unnatural. It was like a distortion, a dark, shifting figure that seemed to pulse and stretch as if it was made of shadows themselves. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My entire body locked in place, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared, melting into the shadows of the hallway. I stood there, frozen, my pulse deafening in my ears. The scraping started again, louder now, and it was coming closer. The presence was right behind me. You shouldn't have come back. The voice was clear now, unmistakable. It wasn't a whisper, it was a command, and it was coming from all around me. I stood there, paralyzed, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice echoed in my ears, and I could feel its weight pressing against my mind. You shouldn't have come back. It wasn't a mere whisper. It was a command, a warning. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in even tighter. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs refused to move. It was as if the very house was holding me captive, its unseen force keeping me rooted in place. I glanced around the hallway, my eyes searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The house had gone eerily silent again. The scraping had stopped, but the presence was still there, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I could feel it, a weight in the air, like the pressure before a storm. My body was trembling, but I couldn't look away from the shadows. I couldn't look away from whatever was waiting for me. Don't turn around. The thought flashed through my mind like a warning, but it was too late. I had already turned. I had already betrayed myself by looking. A pause cast by the forest before he said, "I didn't realize it was you." The hallway stretched out before me, darker than before. The faint light from the front door was now a distant memory, swallowed up by the suffocating darkness. My eyes adjusted, and I could make out the vague shapes of furniture, the shadows cast by objects that seemed to grow longer and more distorted as I watched. But then something moved. It was just a flicker at first, a shift in the darkness, like a shadow darting across the walls. My breath caught in my throat. I knew it wasn't my imagination. Something was there. Something was watching me. I stepped backward, my feet stumbling over the carpet. I could feel the weight of its gaze, a presence that I couldn't escape. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there had been waiting for me, had been watching me the entire time. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening, shaking the very foundations of the house. I spun around, my pulse racing, but there was no time to react. The room was plunged into darkness, and I could feel the temperature drop, a cold so intense it seemed to seep into my bones. I wasn't alone. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper reached my ears. "You should have stayed away." I leaned in, speaking carefully, unable to meet her eyes. The voice came from everywhere, surrounding me, pressing against my mind. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it felt like it was inside me, like it was speaking directly to my soul. I stumbled forward, my hands outstretched, trying to find something, anything to hold on to. But the darkness was thick, suffocating, and I couldn't see a thing. I was completely disoriented, my mind spinning as the air around me grew heavier with every passing second. I had to escape. There had to be a way out. I forced myself to move, to take one step after another, even though my body screamed for me to stop. My feet were unsteady, and my breath was ragged, but I couldn't give up. Not now. I had to find the door. I had to get out of here. But as I stumbled forward, my foot caught on something, and I fell to the ground with a loud thud. Pain shot up my arm, but I barely registered it. My hands scrambled across the floor, searching for anything to pull myself up, and then my fingers brushed against something cold, smooth, and lifeless. Letters? They froze. It was the doll, the one from earlier, the one that had been sitting in the hallway. But how? How had it gotten here? My heart raced as I recoiled from it, my hand jerking back as if burned by the touch. But the doll didn't move. It just sat there, staring up at me with those empty, soulless eyes. "You're not alone." The voice came again, clear and sharp this time. It wasn't the soft whisper I had heard before. It was a command, a declaration, and it was followed by a sound. Scraping, again, the same sound I had heard earlier, only this time it was closer. Much closer. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs shaking, my head spinning. The scraping was relentless, moving in time with my panicked breaths. I couldn't think straight. My thoughts were scattered like broken glass, and all I could focus on was the sound. Mason hesitated, and then just as I was about to turn around, I saw it. A shadow, creeping along the walls, stretching and warping as it moved. It was slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was watch as the shadow inched closer. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. "You've been marked." The words echoed in my mind, and suddenly everything clicked into place. The house wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just the shadows that had been watching me. It was the doll. The doll that had been moving, shifting, changing its position. The doll that had been in my room, in the hallway, in my hands. It was part of this, part of the thing that was haunting me. And now I had become part of it. I turned, desperate to run, but there was no escape. The darkness had swallowed me whole, and the walls were closing in. I could hear the scraping again, but it wasn't coming from the doll anymore. It was coming from everywhere, and it was getting closer. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, suffocating under the weight of the silence and the dread that filled the air. The scraping sound was louder now, like fingernails against wood, relentless and unforgiving. It was everywhere, coming from all directions, as though the very walls were alive, closing in around me. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I stumbled backward, my hands brushing against the cold walls, seeking something, anything that could give me a sense of security. But there was nothing. No safe place, no escape, only the suffocating darkness and the unsettling sound that continued to grow louder with every passing second. "You're not alone." The voice returned, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was clear, sharp, and filled with malice. It came from the darkness itself, from the shadows that seemed to move and shift in the corners of the room. I spun around, desperate to find the source, but all I saw was the endless, oppressive blackness. And then a soft, creaking sound. A door, opening, slowly. A painfully slow sound of our feet slipping over a stone floor. I turned toward it, my heart racing, my body frozen in place. The door at the end of the hallway, the one I hadn't noticed before, was ajar. Just a crack, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I couldn't resist. My legs moved on their own, as if some unseen force was guiding me toward that door. My mind screamed for me to stop, to turn around and leave, but my feet carried me forward, each step heavy with dread. The air grew colder as I neared the door. I could feel the chill creeping up my spine, wrapping around me like a cold, invisible hand. The scraping had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural hum, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. It was the sound of something ancient, something evil, and it was growing louder. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I gripped the handle. I pulled it open, the hinges creaking in protest. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase, descending into a darkness that seemed to swallow everything in its path. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, and I could feel the weight of something watching me from the bottom of the stairs. I hesitated. I wanted to turn back. But I couldn't. Not now. Not when I was so close to the truth. I took a step forward, then another, and then another, until I was at the foot of the stairs. The hum had turned into a low growl, vibrating through the very floor beneath me. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, pulsing with a dark energy that I couldn't escape. I descended further into the darkness, each step more reluctant than the last. My mind was racing, my thoughts jumbled. What was down here? What had I been drawn to? The fear gnawed at me, but there was something else, something that felt like... I reached the bottom of the stairs and found myself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with old wooden shelves, cluttered with books, dust-covered trinkets, and strange objects that I couldn't quite make out. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its surface cracked and warped. The reflection that stared back at me was distorted, twisted, as if the glass itself had become a gateway to another world. Solidly, I stood before the mirror, open-mouthed. I approached it cautiously, my breath shallow, my body trembling. As I stood before the mirror, I could see it, the faint outline of something behind me, something that shouldn't have been there. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. The room was empty. The shadows seemed to shift and stretch, but nothing moved. I took a step back, my heart racing in my chest. And then, I saw it again. A flicker, a movement, a shadow that was not my own, standing just behind me in the reflection. From my upper best experience, I couldn't see its length. No, you shouldn't have come. The voice was cold, so cold that it sent a chill down my spine. It was not the voice from before. This one was different, older, more malevolent. It was as though the house itself had spoken to me, warning me, condemning me for trespassing. I backed away from the mirror, my mind reeling. What was this place? What had I uncovered? But it was too late now. The house had claimed me, and there was no escaping it. I turned and stumbled toward the stairs, but before I could reach them, a cold hand gripped my shoulder. My body froze, my breath caught in my throat. The hand was ice cold, and it didn't move. It didn't let go. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I couldn't make a sound, couldn't even move. I was paralyzed, trapped in the dark grip of whatever had been waiting for me. My heart pounded in my chest, and my vision blurred. The room spun around me, the shadows growing darker, closer, until they swallowed me whole. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The hand was gone. The growling, the scraping, the whispers, they were all gone. But the silence was worse. It was the kind of silence that settled in your bones, the kind that made you question everything you thought you knew. It was the silence of something waiting, watching, hunting. I was no longer alone. The silence was deafening. It wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket, every breath I took feeling too loud, too invasive. I could still feel the coldness of the hand that had gripped my shoulder, the chill seeping into my skin, as though it had left an imprint on my very soul. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find an explanation. I turned back toward the stairs, but the shadows seemed to shift in the corner of my vision. It was as if the house itself had become a living, breathing thing, its walls pulsating with an unseen energy, its very foundation groaning under the weight of something ancient and malevolent. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. But even as the thought crossed my mind, a deep, unsettling sensation washed over me. I wasn't alone. The presence, that cold, suffocating presence, was still there, lurking just beyond the edge of my perception. I could feel it watching me, waiting for me to make a move, to do something, anything, that would give it a reason to strike. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move, though every step felt like I was walking through quicksand. The air grew heavier with each passing second, thick with dread, as though the house itself was drawing me deeper into its dark embrace. My heart hammered in my chest, the sound of it deafening in my ears. Since the birds were asleep, the hallway stretched out before me, long and empty, but the feeling of being watched never left. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing just behind me, but there was nothing. The house was still, silent. But I knew it wasn't empty. I could feel it. Something was there, something that had been waiting for me to return. I reached the front door, my hand trembling as I fumbled with the doorknob. It was locked. Of course it was locked. The house wouldn't let me leave that easily. Panic surged through me and I rattled the knob, desperate to escape. But the door didn't budge. The The lock was immovable, as if it had been fused shut by some unseen force. "You can't leave." The voice was back, that cold, guttural whisper, right in my ear. It was so close that I could feel the chill of it on my skin. A breath that wasn't mine. A presence that wasn't human. My blood ran cold as I turned to face the source of the voice. But again, there was nothing. No figure, no shape, just the empty, suffocating space around me. I backed away from the door, my mind spiraling into panic. The house was closing in. I could feel the walls pressing in on me, the air thick with a palpable sense of danger. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart racing as I turned to look at the hallway again. And then I saw it. A shadow, flickering at the edge of my vision. It was small at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew, stretching across the floor like a living thing. I could see it moving, twisting and writhing, as though it had a mind of its own. It slithered toward me, faster now, its form taking shape in the dim light. I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. "You're not leaving." I took a step back, my foot catching on something behind me. I stumbled, falling hard to the floor, but I didn't care. I couldn't take my eyes off the shadow, the dark shape that was now creeping toward me with unnatural speed. I scrambled backward, my hands frantically searching for something to hold onto. The room seemed to shift, the walls warping and bending as if the house itself was alive, its very structure bending to the will of whatever dark force resided within it. The shadow loomed closer, its form becoming more defined with every passing second. And then I heard it. A sound soft at first, like a whisper, but growing louder with each passing moment. It was a name. My name. "You belong here." The words were distorted, twisted, as if they were coming from deep within the house itself. I couldn't understand them, but I could feel them. They were calling to me, pulling me in, like a siren song that promised an end to my suffering, but would only lead me deeper into darkness. I shook my head, trying to block out the voice, the sound of it crawling into my mind, taking root in my thoughts. But it was no use. The shadow was upon me now, its tendrils reaching out, curling around my limbs, pulling me toward it. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. I was trapped. "You're mine now." The words echoed in my mind, a final haunting declaration. The shadow enveloped me, consuming me whole. I could feel it, inside me, crawling through my veins, spreading like a poison, filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread and despair. And then, everything went black. I awoke with a start, gasping for breath, my body drenched in cold sweat. The darkness of the room felt suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. My heart pounded in my chest, its rhythm erratic and frantic. I could still feel the cold tendrils of the shadow creeping through my thoughts, leaving a lingering sense of dread that refused to let go. I blinked, trying to orient myself, but the room around me seemed foreign, unfamiliar. The walls, the floor, everything felt wrong. I sat up slowly, my hand shaking as I touched the surface beneath me. It wasn't the same room I had been in before. The furniture was different, the layout disorienting, as if the very house had shifted while I was unconscious. I glanced around, my eyes wide, searching for any sign of what had happened. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of my own breathing. There were no shadows creeping along the walls, no whispers in the air, no cold, suffocating presence. But that didn't mean I was safe. The house had changed. I had changed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stood up, unsteady on my feet, my legs weak as though I hadn't used them in years. My head spun, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse again. But I forced myself to keep moving, each step an effort, each breath a struggle. The fear that had gripped me before was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I stumbled to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. It turned easily, and I stepped out into the hallway, my senses heightened, every nerve screaming with alertness. The house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. As I moved through the halls, I noticed the changes more clearly. The once familiar walls now felt alien, their surfaces warped and twisted. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but there was something unsettling about the way they groaned. Like they were trying to warn me, or perhaps hold me in place. I reached the staircase and paused, staring down at the dark, endless steps that led into the unknown. The house had never felt like this before. It was as if the walls were alive, their very structure changing in response to my presence. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something else. Something metallic, like blood. The soundings of my shoes faded away as I walked back to the middle of the staircase. I reached the bottom for the light switch, then stopped short. My thoughts drifted back to the shadow, the cold, suffocating presence that had nearly consumed me. It hadn't just been a figment of my imagination. It had been real, and I could still feel it, lurking in the depths of my mind, waiting for the moment I would let my guard down. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thought. I couldn't let it control me. I couldn't let it control me. I turned away from the stairs, deciding to explore the rest of the house. The longer I stayed, the more the feeling of unease gnawed at me. The house seemed to be closing in, its very walls shifting as if they were alive, watching, waiting. I reached the living room and froze. There, in the center of the room, was something I hadn't noticed before. A small, intricately carved wooden box. It sat on the coffee table, its presence so out of place that it made my stomach turn. The box seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though it was drawing the air around it, sucking in the very essence of the room. I took a step forward, my hand hovering over the box, drawn to it by an invisible force. I couldn't resist. Something inside me told me I needed to open it. I needed to see what was inside. But as my fingers brushed against the surface, a wave of nausea hit me. I recoiled, stumbling back, as though the box had burned me. My heart raced in my chest, and I could feel the presence again. The same cold, malevolent force that had gripped me earlier. You should have never come back. The voice whispered in my ear, so close that I could feel its breath against my skin. My blood ran cold as I spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. No one. Just the empty, oppressive air. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling, trying to process what was happening. My body was shaking uncontrollably, my thoughts fragmented, scattered. The house was alive, its presence all around me, suffocating, pressing in. I had to get out. I had to leave before it consumed me completely. But as I reached for the door, I froze. The shadow was back. It loomed in the corner of the room, its shape more distinct now. A dark figure that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. It was watching me, its presence palpable, its intent clear. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the floor as I made my way toward the exit. The door was right there, just a few steps away, but the shadow was closing in. I could hear its whispers, its guttural growls, growing louder with each passing second. I reached the door and flung it open, stumbling out into the night air. The cold hit me like a physical blow, but it was a welcome relief. I had escaped. Or so I thought. As I stood there, gasping for breath, I looked back at the house. It loomed in the distance, its dark windows staring back at me like empty eyes. And I knew, deep in my bones, that it wasn't over. The house was still there, waiting for me to return, and it would always be there, lurking in the shadows, calling me back. "You belong here." The words echoed in my mind as I turned and ran into the night, the darkness closing in behind me.